Alright, I'm gonna do a Cons of Tarkir set review here for Limited. So I'm gonna use the Limited Resources ranking system. I think it's great, so why not use it? So Ace are some of the best cards in the set, like Bonehorde, Dracosaurus. If you see them, you're gonna take them and heavily consider moving into that color if you open in pack 2. Bs are cards that if you open them, you're gonna skew heavily to that color. Could also be some reason to change. They are always making your deck in great cards like Suedic Glyph. These are the cards that fill out your decks, and you're gonna have most of these in your deck. It's like Poison Dart Frog. Good cards that you hope to pick up a little later, but if you have to first pick them, that's how it is. These are cards that you do not like to play, and they are considered fillers, like your 23rd card, like Malakir Veteran. Then Fs are unplayable cards, like constructed cards, like Millennium Calendar. So first, let's talk about some of the white guilds, because Cons of Tarkir is a guild set, which means that you're usually going to be 3 colors. You can be 2 colors too sometimes, and actually it's good that I start with white, because one archetype that you will see is white-black with warriors, and it's not like every card in your deck, creature in your deck has to be a warrior. You see that the first 3 cards here, none of them are warriors, but you have some small warrior themes. There are cards that pump up all warriors you have, and there are even an Overrun-esque card for warriors. But the main guilds are Absan, green, white, black, Jeskai, blue, red, white, and Mardu, red, black, white. And Absan is a little more controlling and mid-rangey, and Jeskai and Mardu are a little more aggressive. Jeskai is more like a tempo deck, using like blue tap-down card, bounce spells, and red burn spells. And you're trying to push through the last damage. There is also a red card that makes creatures unable to block if you have a 4-powered creature that you can play sometimes. Mardu is more a go-wide strategy, which you're making a lot of goblins. There are some Overrun effects you can play. You also are often a warrior sub-theme in your deck. Whereas Absent is more controlling and grind. You have a lot of good removal in black. You have some good beefy creatures in green. There are some life linkers, and Outlaws is a mechanic which you can go heavy on, or just have like a minor sub-theme, but it's often a little bit slower. So let's start here, and we are starting with some good cards here. So Absent Battle Priest, 3 and a white for a 3/2. It has Outlast for a white, so if you want, you can during your main phase play or it's a sorcery speed. White, tap it and put a counter on it. And it says that each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has lifelink. So sometimes this will buff some of your other creatures and give them lifelink. And it is by itself is going to become a 4/3 lifelink if you can afford to tap it. And the fact that it has lifelink means that you can get back a little bit of the time back when you spend to outlast it, because lifelink is a little bit of a tempo, because you are gaining life, which means you're going to survive longer. It's also harder for your opponent to ignore lifelink creatures, so they may have to keep some creatures back to block it. So this is a good card. I want to say it's about a B-. It's better than it looks at first glance. It looks like, oh, a 3/2 for 4, that's kind of slow. But the lifelink is huge, and lifelink means that it's very hard to raise this, especially if you have other creatures with +1/+1 counters, like other Outlaws creatures. Also a card like Feet of Resistance, which you're going to get to, which puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature, and also gives protection. So that's already a pretty good combo, because first of all, you can protect this creature. That goes for all the Outlaws creatures, but also gives the lifelink and protection, which is a good deal. Because you're gaining the life already, and you're gonna get, since it survives because of protection, you're gonna get another hit in. Absent Falcons might actually be even better than the last card. It's 2 and a white for a 2/3, Outlast for a white, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 on it gains flying. So this is more of an aggressive card than the other one, but it's cheaper, and it has a similar body for almost the same mana cost, like a 2/3 instead of a 3/2. So this is a card that it's not going to catch you up when you're behind as good as the last card, but it's way more aggressive because, again, flying on some of your creatures is just huge, and this is a card you can easily just slot the curve, and you play this on 3. Then on turn 4 you pump this up and play a 3-drop like a Morph, which is a big theme in this set. And then you're good to go, you have a 3/4 flyer. So this I think is a B, almost like a B+ in a heavy deck with a lot of counters. Very good card. Inuk Bonkin is another solid Outlaws creature. It's 1 and white for a 2/1. As out as 1 and a white, so now you have to pay 1 more. But it says that each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has first strike. So this is a good attacker and defender, because if you got a bunch of creatures with counters on them, it's impossible for your opponent to attack through the ground, because you just first strike down at like double blocks. It also attacks very good as a 3/2. This is a little worse than the other one because it takes a little longer to set up, but it's also cheaper to cast. So I think this is a C+. I want this card in all my white decks. You don't have to be absent, and that goes for the other cards too. It's just a solid card. You can play it on turn 2 and trade it off if you're on defensive. You can even trade for a morph if your opponent doesn't have 4 mana or 5 mana up. But then late game it also can become a huge threat. So C+ for that card. Alabaster Kirin, 3 and white for 2/3 with flying and vigilance. It's okay. It does block morphs early before there are a chance to flip up and can attack through for some damage. Pretty nice target for counts. I think it's about a C. It's not a great card, it's not a bad card. It's a card you can put in your deck and not be too unhappy about it. But I wouldn't want to play too many of these because they are 4-drops are not like premium, and 2/3 is a little low stats even though it has some good abilities. So C for that card. Brave Ascent, 1 and a white for an enchantment. And it says that creatures you control have vigilance. That's usually not worth a card. And each creature you control can block an additional creature. I think this is a bad card. It gives you some defensive abilities to your creatures, but it doesn't buff them. It doesn't give you any aggressive at all, because vigilance is basically a defensive ability. And blocking an additional creature is cool, but how many? That doesn't even scale that well, because you have 3 creatures that can block an additional creatures. It basically doesn't do much. I want to give this card a D-. Maybe there is like a matchup for this, but I have a hard time seeing. Dazzling Ramparts, 4 and a white for 07 defender. 1 and a white tap target creatures. Pretty bad card because you're paying 5 mana for 07, so that blocks everything. But why would you want to tap something when you got a good blocker? I guess the idea is that you play this and it blocks everything on the ground, and then later in the game you can tap an evasive creature, but it's very clunky. The one deck where I can see this being good is like an Absent deck that has some good things going on with high toughness, because there is a theme. But I think this is a D. It's a 23rd card if you absolutely need to, but it's not a good card. Defiant Strike, we've seen this in later sets as well. White mana, instant, target creature get +1/+0 until end of turn, draw a card. So this is a card, I think this card is a C in a Jeskai deck, because Jeskai has prowess as a mechanic, but it doesn't do very much, and doesn't add any counters, doesn't add toughness. So I think it's a C- D+. It's a card you can play, but it's not great. But in Jeskai, I think it performs about a C. Even then, I don't think it's great, because you're gonna have draws where you don't even draw too many of the prowess creatures, but it's not a terrible card. And this is also a kind of card you can take and know that you have a 23rd card if you need it. End Hostilities, 3 white. Destroy all creatures and all permanents attached to creatures. So those are auras and equipment, if the equipment is attached to something. So if you got this card, you may want to wait to have your opponent equip an equipment if they have one. This is fine. It's a 5 mana Wrath, but as we've seen lately, we usually get some kind of bonus on Wraths, and this one doesn't have any. It's not a bad card. I think it's about a B- C+, and I would look to play this in Absan mostly, because Absan is more controlling in mid-range. If I'm Mardu, Black-White Warriors, or Jeskai, it goes down to like a C level card, because you're looking to be ahead, and this is not a card that even gonna solve you some problems, because if you reset the board, you still have to win after that. But it's very good I think it's good in apps, and it is like a B- B in apps, because there you have some card draw spells as well. Erase, 1 white mana for an instant, exile target enchantment. There aren't too many enchantments in this set, so this is just a sideboard card, a sideboard C-. It's not even that good of a sideboard card, because the problem is, what if your opponent doesn't draw the enchantment? So it's not even a good sideboard card. So it's an F, but maybe C- out of the sideboard against like some very problematic card, like maybe a Trail of Mystery, Secret Plan style of deck. But it's not even that good because sometimes those deck doesn't draw that card. So the next one might be a sleeper or may not if you played this format before. Feat of Resistance. 1 on the right for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So this has good synergy with Outlast because some of the Outlast creatures have abilities and you're gonna get to cheat on that. You can even play this on an Outlast creatures and then it will have the bonus. It also makes that if your morph attacks against your opponent's morphs, you can save your creature, and even though morphs are colorless, maybe your creature survives even though you don't need a colorless card. I think it's a C+, it's a solid card. I wrote 1 or 2 in almost all my white decks. Even in Absam, which is a little slower, you have Outlast creatures and you have some lifelinkers, and if you combine, that can almost be a game that wins you the game if you can combine a lifelinker with Feat of Resistance. Very good. Firehoof Cavalry, white mana for a 1/1, and it is a human berserker, so not a warrior. And you can pay 3 in a red to give it +2/+0 and gain trample under turn. So obviously this is only playable in Jeskai and Mardu, but it's not even good there because the ability doesn't give any toughness. And just think about it, you need 8 mana for this to be a 5-power trample to even threaten something. A 3/1 trample is not even that good. So I want to say this is another D-. It's a card that I don't really see why you want to play. Herald of Anafensa. It's a rare white mana for a 1/2. I think it's our first rare. No, End of Hostilities was the first one. Okay. So it's 1 mana 1/2. Pretty good place to start. Outlast 2 and a white. So this is the most expensive Outlast we've seen so far. 2 and a white, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on this. And whenever you activate the Outlast ability, you get a 1/1 warrior. So that you can get that even if your opponent responds with a removal spell, because you already activated it. This card is good, but it's a little slow. It's not a bad card, but you are paying 3 mana to get a 1/1 and put a counter on something. You're getting it sort of for free if you can afford to spend mana. I think this is about a C+, B-. I remember this card being good but not great because it's slow and clunky and there are times where you have other things to do, like flip up a morph, cost other cards. But in the late game it does create a chump every turn and it does slowly grow into a threat. And it's probably at its best in Absam because then this can also key off your other Outlaws. So if this gets like lifelink or flying, eventually you can just make a 1/1, grow this, and then eventually just attack your opponent pretty hard from that point on. Okay, so here we have a sick card. High Sentinel's Arashin. 3 and a white for a 3/4 flyer. Very good start. I would already be happy about that. But it also gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with a +1/+1 counter. So every Outlast creature you have managed to pump up, this even grows even bigger. But if that wasn't enough, you can pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Which could be itself, although it's not going to get +1/+1 from the static. But if you pay the mana, put counters on something else, this also grows. I think this is an A. It doesn't get to A+ because it doesn't it can be a little slow to come from a game you're very behind from. But it's a fantastic card, obviously. But it's an A, doesn't get to A+, but A. Very good card, and especially good in Absam, where you can get bonuses from the counters, but it's awesome in Jeskai and Mardu, of course, as well. Jeskai Student, 1 and a white for 1/3 prowess, and it's a filler card. I don't even like it in Jeskai. It's the problem is that it has just 1 power naturally, so even if you pump this up a bunch, it's still not going to be amazing. I think it's a D+. It's okay. Kill Shot, 2 and a white for an instant, destroy target attacking creature. So we've seen way better versions of this lately, like the cost 2 mana or they give some bonus. One good thing about this card is if your opponent got a bunch of morphs, you can block and wait for your opponent to flip up the big morph to blow you out. Then you have this 3 mana card that kind of kills whatever the most relevant morph is. But again, it's like a D level card. I don't think it's great, and I would mostly look to play it in Abzan when I'm more controlling. And often in Abzan you have better options to play anyway. Alright, so Mardu Hateblade. This is white mana for a 1/1. You can pay black to give it death touch until the end of turn. And this is a warrior, which is good. It's a fine card. It's a card that also is pretty good at enabling raid, which is a mechanic that you will see on the next card that triggers every time you have attacked. Because this one can at the very least trade for almost anything and enable raid. It's okay. It's a card that can also trade for something big later on, and it's not embarrassing earlier. So I think it's about a C. It's better if you got some warrior synergies or raid. So it's obviously not a Jeskai card, and it's mostly a Mardu card, I think, although Absent can also play it. Mardu Horde Shift, 2 and a white for a 2/3, and if you have enabled raid, you get a 1/1, which also is a warrior, the one when you're getting. This is a good card. I think that if you're somewhat aggressive, it gets even better. It's even better if you got warrior synergies. It's a C+ in a warrior deck that's also assertive. So you can be black, white, or Mardu. In Absent, it's more like a C, because there you may not always be able to attack. But it's a solid card. And it has a pretty good reason to play like an overrun card, which you're going to get to in a second. Master of Pearls, 1 and white for a 2/2. And this is our first morph, so 3 white, white. So you play this for 3 mana as a 2/2 vanilla, but then you have 5 mana to flip it up. And it says that when it turned up, creatures you control get +2/+2 until the end of turn. And that can happen in combat, so there's no sorcery speed on that. This is a very threatening card, and it's good in every white deck. I think it's about a B. It's a card you almost never want to just play for 2 mana. You want to get the bonus. But if you're like stuck on lands or absolutely need to curve out with a 2-drop, it's okay to do that as well. But it's a kind of morph that your opponent's gonna have a very hard time playing around because it's a rare, so you can get some insane blowouts with this card, like wreck the opponent's board. You can also just kill your opponent sometimes. So it's good in every white deck. I think it's about a B. Rush of Battle. I think this is a builder up. 3 and a white for a sorcery. Creature you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. And warrior creatures you control also gain lifelink until the end of turn. So this is sorcery speed, so you're not going to be surprised your opponent. But these types of effects, sometimes it doesn't matter that there are sorceries because you're either killing your opponent or you're not casting it. So, but if you're a warrior deck, the lifelink means you're going to get a lot of value from the lifelink. You're going to get to enable extra turns to top deck like a burn spell if you're like Mardu, or like top deck a flyer. And so it's a build around C+ in a super dedicated warrior deck. I think this card is pretty threatening, but you almost never want to play more than one, and you're gonna cut it from a lot of white decks. So it's a C+ in a right deck, but I would probably only pick it about like a C- because you don't have to pick that card very highly, ideally. Sage Eye Harrier. Now the warrior are coming one after one. 4 and white for a 1/5 flower, and that's obviously way below the thing you want to get for 5 mana, but it has more 3 and a white, so now it morphs up for 4, which is a little more rare than 5. Not a great card. It is a warrior though, and there is a card in black that says that whenever a warrior you control this combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card and lose a life. So that's a neat combo with this. It also has high toughness, so it may like work with some of the Absent things, but all in all it's a C-. It's not a terrible card. And the thing about morphs are, they're not always that bad, because you can just run them out on turn 3, trade it off for another morph or some 2-drop. So morph could never be that horrible, but this is one of the weaker morphs, I want to say. So C- for that. And Salt Road Patrol, 3 and a white for a 2/5. It has Outlast 1 and a white, but no other abilities. I never liked this card. I thought that this itself doesn't give any bonuses to other cards. It's very slow and clunky. Yes, it blocks pretty well, but if you want to block with it, you can't really outlast it. And it's not like outlasting this gets you that far. So I think it's a D+, pretty filler card. I don't like it even in Absent. Seeker of the Way. This card has seen some playing constructed. 1 and white for a 2/2 with prowess. So already I'm more excited about this than the 1/3. But it also says that whenever you cast a non-creature spell, which is prowess, I guess, it gains lifelink at the end of turn. Very good card. I think it's about a B-. It's the thing about this card is this is not as good as constructed, because you can't just indefinitely just play non-creature spells and give it lifelink, but it's a very good value card, and you only need like one trigger for this card to pay off, because then it's a 2/2 for 2 that gain you 3 life and also dealt 3 damage. So B- for Seeker of the Way. It's good, but don't think that this is like a bomb like it wasn't being constructed. Siegecraft, 3 and a white for an aura. Enchant creature is +2/+4. Pretty bad card. It does give you a lot of bonuses, but the thing about this, there are hexproof creatures in blue, so maybe you can play this in like a blue-white weird deck with some Jeskai hexproof. But the problem with this card is that +2/+4 plus no other abilities by itself doesn't get you very far. If this gave lifelink or flying, it would maybe be worth the risk, but here you're not even getting that big payoff for the risk, so I think it's a D-. There are also matchups, like maybe you play against like a red deck with most of the removal is burn. If you can sneak this through on a flyer or a lifelink, it can be okay. So I think it's not an F, but it's a D-. Smite the monsters, 3 and a white for an instant to start with power 4 or greater. This is usually not a good card, but it's a little better in this form because of Morph, because like you could with Kill Shot, you can wait for opponent to flip up a Morph and then kill it. But it's still not a great card. I think it's a D. It's a filler card, but you can like throw it in your side. If you're playing against an Absent deck, maybe it's pretty fun. It's decent. Suspension Field, 1 and a white for enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile target creature with toughness 3 or greater until it leaves the battlefield. So it's like a little bit of a reverse Glass Casket. Not exactly, but it does take out big things, or like big butts, I guess. It's solid though. I think it's almost like better than Glass Casket because it gets bigger things, and exiling it is so much better than like putting like a pacifism on it because it's gone, so your opponent can't sacrifice it or bounce it. I think it's a B- again. Very solid card, and the only awkward thing is that if you want to get your opponent morphs, you're gonna get to have to be attacked first, because your opponent's gonna have to flip up the morph first, and then presumably you got attacked. So that's what keeps me from being higher, but it's a solid card. Take up Arms, 4 and a white for an instant, and you get 3/1/1 white warrior creatures. It is an instant, so you can, but you're not gonna ambush with 1/1s. You may like trade off, get some good trade-offs. Mostly a warrior payoff cards. I wouldn't play it like in a normal white deck with no warrior payoffs. It's a builder on C+. If I got some lords that pump up warriors, it becomes good. Or if I'm having like some overrun, like it's pretty good with the 3 and a white sorcery, because then you're getting 3 3/2s lifelinkers, and it's pretty impossible to raise that. So it can be a centerpiece. You can have some things going on here, but I wouldn't just throw it in a regular white deck. It's a C+ or a D- if you don't have anything to go with. Timely Hordemate, 3 and a white for a 3/2 warrior. Raid, when it enters the battlefield, if you attack for a creature's turn, return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from graveyard to the battlefield. So that could be the card you attacked with. There are some good cards, like the 2/1. There is a 2/1 for 2 that makes your opponent discard a card if you raid it. So if you attack with that, your opponent ideally trades. You play this, get that card back, your opponent has to discard another card. So then you can be in the pretty good value town. This is a card that plays out a little worse than it looks. You don't always get that back. I think it's about a C+, and I would look to have a lot of small creatures with some good enter the battlefield effects before I was excited to play it, because a 4 mana 3/2 is not particularly good. It just doesn't work like you want it to be all the time. Venerable Lamasu, 6 and white for 5/4 flying. That's it. Not a good card. It's just the way Morph works is that if you want to play some expensive cards, you can just throw a Morph in there, and then when you reach the high mana, you can just flip it up. So I think it's a D. Pretty bad. It is a big flyer, but 4 toughness on a 7-drop also means that you're gonna have this card just be killed sometimes. And if it gets bounced, you're sad. So D, it's not unplayable, but War Behemoth, another Morph, 5 and white for 3/6, Morph for 4 and white. So as with most Morphs, you wanna not hard cast it, but play it and then morph it up. It's another C-, I think. It's perfectly fine, but it's not exciting. And this is the first example of the Morph 5 rule, which is in this set. It means that when your opponent reaches 5 mana and has Morphs, if they flip it up, it's going to be pretty huge and hard to kill. So this card's going to eat some cards sometimes, because a 3/6 is a weird stat line that can, like, if your opponent blocks with a 4/3, they're out of luck. So I think it's a C-. It's not a terrible card, it's not a great card. It has no good creature types either. It does have high toughness though. Now here's another one I really like though. It's a Watcher of the Roost. 2 and a white for a 2/1 flyer. So if you play it face up, now you could do it without being too embarrassed. It's not great, but this is a card that you can cast without Morph, without it being like horrible at least. And Morph reveal a white card in your hand, and when it's turned face up, you gain 3 life. So this is you almost have to break this card down a little bit, because this is almost gonna be a 3 mana 2/1 flyer that's sometimes gonna gain you 2 life when you flip it up. And a 3 mana 2/1 flyer that gains you 2 life when it comes to play, that's a solid card. It's not like bomb level or anything, but I think it's about a C+. And this one also has a little bit of hiding information. Maybe your opponent's got a very good 3/2 flyer that has some good ability when it connects. I don't know what it will be. You can play this and then ambush it. It also is nice that this sometimes will surprise your opponent, that you have 2 evasive damage that your opponent may not have thought you had. So it might just swing a race pretty good. I think it's a C+. The 2 life is nice on an evasive card because it takes away some of the downsides of playing a fragile flyer, in that it doesn't block very well. Well, the 2 life helps a little bit. Just remember that there are a cycle of these, that sometimes if you're gonna play the last white card from your hand, you should remember to flip this card up before you do that, because you may not be able to. Then you would have to top deck a white card to be able to flip it up. So if you want this card to be flipped up, just remember to flip this up before you play your last white card. Speaking of the last white card, it's probably one of the best cards in this set. Wingmate Rock. 3 white for a 3/4 flyer, a mythic rare. And it has raid. When it enters the battlefield, if you attack with a creature this turn, you get another 3/4 flyer. So if you raid this card, it's one of the sickest cards ever. And it's not that hard. This is also a card that you can suicide a creature that's expendable just to get a 3/4 flyer. Because 5 mana for 2 3/4 flyers is almost unbeatable in limited. They're both evasive, they both have high toughness, and God forbid you get to bring this card back from your graveyard somehow. There are some black cards that do that. Then you're in trouble. Also, fly means that this card can itself enable raid. Oh yes, I forgot to mention it has another text. When it attacks, you gain 1 life for each attacking creature. So it's going to be very hard for your opponent to raise this card, because you're going to get a 2 life if you got to attack with the 2 3/4 flags. So forget about raising this card. I'm gonna give this card an A+. If this card doesn't give an A+, I don't know what does. So. And that will lead us to blue. And first card is Blinding Spray. 4 and a blue for an instant. Creature your opponent's control get -4 -0 until the end of turn, draw a card. So the idea is that you gotta get a 2/1 or even a 3/1 by blocking. It can also be sort of like a farm. I remember this card being okay. It was a little harder to set up than it looked, and it also was somewhat telegraphed. Even if your opponent doesn't know exactly what you have, when you pass with 5 mana up in blue, your opponent's gonna be at the very least a little suspicious. I think it's about a C+ though. It does also work on offense sometimes. You can attack, your opponent makes some blocks, you play this mana, maybe you trigger some prowess cards. So it's a C+, it's not a bomb, but it's a pretty solid card. Oh yeah, I'm just gonna mention the guilds for blue. So there are Jeskai, I already talked about that. There is Temur, which is green, blue, red. It has a huge emphasis on 4-powered creatures. There is a falter effect for that. And the last one is Sultai, which is black, green, blue, and it has a self-mill component with Delve. And Jeskai is aggressive, the other twos are less aggressive. Temur is more like a mid-range, and Sultai is probably the most controlling deck of all. You're looking to control the board, delve cards, and go to town. Next up we have Cancel, 1 blue, instant counter target spell. This is almost never a good card, and it's even less good in the format Morphs, because I've talked about counter spells in format with Suspend, where they get better, because you see face up what's coming. In a format with morphs, instead of casting a spell, your opponent can just flip up a morph. So it's even worse in this format. So I think it's a D-. It's a card you almost never want to play. Clever Impersonator. 2 blue for a 0/0. So when you play it, it dies immediately. No, wait. It becomes a copy of any non-land permanent on the battlefield. So it's a clone that can also copy your opponent's stuff. And it can copy non-land permanents. But you're mostly going to copy a creature. Maybe if you're lucky, you can copy a planeswalker. But this is a fine card. It's a C+. I don't think it's like a super good card because one of the problems is that if you copy a morph, you have to flip it up first. So you can't. If you copy a morph when it's face down, you're not going to be able to flip up Clever Impersonator. And some of the cards are small. You're almost never going to get a huge advantage out of this clone, I don't think. So C+, perfectly playable card, of course. And you're mostly going to copy creatures. Crippling Shield, 2 and a blue for an instant. You tap a creature, it doesn't untap your controller's next untapped step. Draw a card. I remember this card being very solid. It's good in Jeskai because that's a tempo deck. This is one of the pillars of a tempo deck. You're looking down a creature for 2 turns. And you get to draw a card. In Salta, it's fine because you're getting a card in your graveyard for Delve and buys you some time. In Temur, it's less good, but you still have some good things going on with it. I think it's a C+. I think I like Crippling Shield in almost all my blue decks. It's also a card you don't need to play on turn 3, but yeah, it's solid. It's solid. Dig Through Time. This is another card that's less good in Limited and in Constructed, but it's still not a terrible card. 6 blue, and it has Delve, so you can exile cards from your graveyard to reduce the cost of 1. And you look at the top 7 cards of your library, put 2 of them in your hand and rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So the idea of this card is to trade, play removal, and then cost this for cheap late in the game, and then you can play one of the cards in the same turn because you cost this. You make this so cheap. It's funny, this card is almost better in non-Sultai decks because Sultai deck has other Delve cards which are competing with this card, so you're gonna empty your graveyard for other stuff. So it might even be better in Jeskai or Temur than in the other guilds. Yeah, I think it's particularly good in Jeskai because it also gives you 1 prowess trigger for this card. Maybe you find some instants that give you even more prowess triggers. I think it's a B-. It's a rock solid card advantage card. But it is not as good as it is in Constructor because it's not that easy to fill up your graveyard. Like in Constructor you have fetch lands, brainstorms, ponders, serum visions like that, lightning bolts, which you don't have here, but it's still a good card. Disdainful Stroke, 1 and a blue for an instant. You counter target spell commander cost 4 or greater. So that's with cancel. This is much worse in this format than it was in like Lost Eldraine sets. It's a little better than cancel because it's easier to cast, and blue is rough in a set where you want to be 3 colors. Does not counter morphs. It doesn't even counter morphs on the way down, but it does hit some good things later on. I think this is a C-. I'm not in love with the card, but it's way more playable than cancel, just mostly because of the mana cost, and it's one seems cheaper after all. Dragon's Eye Savants. This is the cycle that you have to reveal a card. 1 and a blue for 06. So that's not a good card, but it's at least something that you can play at. It blocks everything. So we usually don't get 2 mana 06s. But that would be like a D+ C-. But it has morph, reveal a blue card in your hand. And when it turns face up, look at target opponent's hand. Which is marginal, but decent. It would be much better if you could look at your opponent's morphs. But it's a small bonus. The most thing that I like about this card is you play this, your opponent points a burn spell or a debilitating injury, that's the dead weight of the set, on this card to get rid of it before it flips up. And then you flip it up and save it, and you have this annoying blocker into play. The ideal scenario is your opponent costs like a 2 mana burn spell on this. Then you're very happy because you got a free card out of the deal. It's also a card that you can play early, maybe get some attacks in, and in late game it blocks everything. All in all, slightly weaker than the white one, I think, but it's a C. I think this is a card I'm happy to play in almost all my blue decks if I'm not super aggressive. So if I'm like a Jeskai deck that are looking to be aggressive, I don't think I want this card. But in a Sultai deck, I think it's about a C+, and in a Teamer deck it's like C. Embodiment of Spring, blue mana for 0/3, so more big butts here. 100 green, you sack it and get a basic land, put it in the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. It's okay in Teamer, and it's a little better in Sultai, because then you're getting a body in your graveyard for Del. It's still clunky, it doesn't do much. Also, it's a ramp card that you have to wait a turn. You can't play it and sack it immediately like you can with some of these creatures. So you have to wait a turn. You get a block in. Maybe you can block like a morph if your opponent flips it up. You do this, but it's a D+. It's not a great card. A little better in Sultai, I think. It's just too slow and it doesn't do much. It's not a good ramp card and it's not a good creature. That's the problem. Force Away, 1 blue for an instant, you return a creature to its owner's hand, and you have Ferocious, you get to loot as well. So you're still down a card, but at least you got a selection. And maybe if you discard like a land, you're not feel like you're down a card that bad. It's decent. Also, it's nice in Sultai that this puts 2 cards in your graveyard if you have a 4-powered creature. I think it's a C. It's a perfect playable card. It's probably at its best in Jeskai because you're a tempo deck, and you can play it in response to someone flipping up a morph. That's the nice thing about this card. You are down a card, but bouncing an expensive morph can feel pretty good. So it's probably a little better than it looks, I think. Glacial Stalker, 5 and a blue for a 4/5, so you don't want to do that if you're not desperate. But it has more 4 and a blue, and it becomes like a 4/5. This card I remember being pretty solid because it's a 4-power creature for Teamer. And it's just a solid card in almost every deck because 5 mana 4/5, it feels like it has haste somehow. You play it and then you flip it up and it has haste. You're gonna eat something. If your opponent's not aware about a 5 mana rule, your opponent's gonna get wrecked by this card. I think it's still just a C, but I remember being pretty happy about that card. It also is nice that it only flips up for 1 color, so you're gonna get to do that in most games. And morphs are inherently pretty decent because you can just play them without having the colored mana for it. Icy Blast, X and a blue for an instant, you tap X target creatures, so ideally you want to do that during your opponent's turn, and that's why it's an instant. But if you've got Ferocious, you basically put a stun counter on them, they don't untap. Very powerful card. It's not that good in Sultai, but in Jeskai and Teamer it is great, because Jeskai wants this type of card that can finish the game, and Teamer often has a 4-powered creature. So I think this card is a B+, it's very good. In Sultai it's more like a C-level card, because you're not that aggressive, so you're not going to get to attack your opponent. The trick with this card is that you don't want to use it to buy time. You want to use it to kill your opponent ideally. With maybe some combination of other cards. But it's very powerful if you are aggressive. It's a B+ then. And you want to have a lot of creatures or big creatures so you can finish the game. It's not good in a deck with a ton of spells, because then you're going to have a hard time using the time you get from. Jeskai Elder, 1 blue for 1/2 with prowess, but this one has that when it is combat damage you play, you get to loot. So this is a card that's good on the play because you get to threaten the prowess and then you may get to loot it. The nice thing about this card is that the prowess means that it's harder for your opponent to make a block on turn 2 or 3. Or turn 3, I should say. And then you may get to loot. So in Sultai it's nice because you get the looting is very valuable to fill up your grave for Del. And in the other, in Jeskai you have a lot of non-creature spells ideally. I think it's a C+, solid card. The problem with this card is, of course, in the late game it falls off quite a bit. It's very good on turn 2, but it falls off a lot in the late game. But C+, solid card. Another solid card is Jeskai Windscout, 2 and a blue for a 2/1 with flying and prowess. So not a Sultai card, more a Jeskai card, as it says on the card. But it's okay in Teamer. Sometimes you can maybe like play 2 spells and then you have Ferocious, if that matters for some static ability. I think it's a C. It could be less C+ in a Jeskai deck, because this is the kind of card you want. It's evasive, grows when you're playing your spells, but it is fragile. Keru Spell Snatcher, 3 and a blue for a 3/3. It has morph for blue. And when it turns face up, you counter a spell. And if that spell is countered, you exile it and you can cast it without paying its mana cost. So very swingy card. The nice thing about this card is you can play it early if you can't kill it, so be it. But then in the late game, you may just pass with 6 mana and your opponent thinks, oh, okay, my opponent thinks, oh, that's a big creature. I'm not going to attack, I'm just going to cast a spell instead. So instead of attacking, your opponent plays a spell and then you get to steal that. That's a huge swing. The problem with this card is that it doesn't always work out that way, but it has a lot of potential. I think it's a B. It doesn't get to A level because sometimes your opponent's not going to cooperate. And it's not like this card is very good when you hardcast it 3 and a blue for a free. That's pretty mediocre. So a good card, but just don't have too high hopes of this card. If you have to trade this off early, so be it. Don't be afraid to do it. Another swingy card is Misfire Weaver. 3 and a blue for a free 1 flyer, so you're not happy about that, but this has a high power evasive card. Wars for 2 and a blue, and when it turns face up, target creature you control against hexproof until the end of time, which could be this card, like the your opponent plays like the dead weight on this, you can flip it up. I remember this card being not as good as it looked, but still okay, if you take my meaning from it. It, again, doesn't always work out the way you want it to, and sometimes you would just have to flip this card up and attack. Not that that's a disaster, but it wasn't all the time you got to do the thing, it's just what I'm saying. So I think it's a C+. It's a solid card that probably is a little bit better if you're aggressive, because then you can flip it up and attack, which you don't always want to do in like Salt type. Monastery Flock, 2 and a blue for 05 Defender Flying. It has morphs for a blue. So this sort of looks like the 06, then that the trick with this card is that you wanna have your opponent point a burn spell on this and then you flip it up and you have this free blocker. Or you block something big. Maybe you block like a Glacial Stalker and then you just flip it up for 1 blue. I think it's about a C. I think it's about a C in Sultai. It's mostly a Sultai card. It's not a disaster play card like this in like Teamer, but ideally you want to be more aggressive in those decks. So speaking of that, here's a card that's better if you're aggressive. Mystic of the Hidden Way. 4 and a blue for a 3/2. It's unblockable and it has morph 2 and a blue. So this is a card that you can hardcast without being too embarrassed, because remember on turn 5 you just play a 3/2 that's unblockable. That's pretty threatening. You can also morph it up. That's something you want to do before attacks, of course, because flipping this up after it's being blocked doesn't do anything. So not exactly a Sultai card, more like a Jeskai or Teamer card. It's about a C though. It's not bad. It's not great either. Pearl Lake Ancient. Now this is an expensive card. 5 blue for a 6/7 flash. It can't be countered, but the counter spells in this format are not even that good anyway. But it has a prowess if it needed to be any bigger. And you can return 3 lands you control to its owner's hand and return it to its owner's hand. I remember this card being pretty good, but not amazing. The problem is it doesn't have any flying. It comes out of nowhere. But again, if your opponent passing with 7 mana in blue, some alarm bells should be ringing. So I don't think you're going to ambush things too often. It is nice that it basically is unkillable. Returning 3 lands means that it's a little harder to get into play again. But one thing you can do with this card is to float the mana in response. So let's say your opponent points a murder on this card. You can tap 3 lands, float the mana, and then maybe even recast it in the same turn. So what grade do I want to give this? This is a hard card to grade. I think it's about a B-. It's a pretty good finisher. It's an unkillable large creature, but it doesn't have any trample or flying. It is huge, but there are games where this card is not even gonna finish the game. But it's a solid finisher B-. It's pretty good in Sultai. And it's not exactly a Jeskai card, even though it has prowess, just because it's a little too expensive. Quiet Contemplation, 2 and a blue for enchantment. And when you cast it on creature, you may pay 1. If you do, you put a stun counter on creature and tap it. I never liked this card too much. It is a aggressive card, because this kind of effect is not usually good if it's buying your time. And it's an enchantment. By itself, it does trigger your other prowess cards, but I was never a believer in this card. I think it's about a D. Next up we have Riverwheel Aerialist, 5 and a blue for a 4/5 with flying and prowess. So this card I almost like a little bit better than Pearl Lake Ancient because it's cheaper and it has evasion. So it pays you off. It doesn't protect itself in the same way as a Pearl Lake Ancient, but it kills pretty fast, and flying just means that it flies over all the morphs, most of the morphs anyway. So I think this is another B-, but I think it's a card you can play in almost all the guilds. Just a great finisher, I think. Skulkin, 3 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, and you can pay 2 and a red, sacrifice it to shock something, 2 damage to a creature or player. Pretty clunky and slow. If you play this in second, you have spent 7 mana to do a shock. I guess the idea is that you get some hits in and then maybe you kill your opponent. I think it's a D+, pretty mediocre card. Of course, it's unplayable in Sultai as well. Sign of Glaciers, 2 blue for a 2/5 elemental. You can pay blue to give it +1/-1. It's okay. It's you can have some modal things here when you play it. Attack is harder to block, but it never is that good. If you want to enable Ferocious, you have to pay 2 blue mana. I think it's a C. It's a card you can put in your deck, but I was never too excited about it. I guess it's nice that it blocks morphs early, but yeah. Alright, next up, Set Adrift, 5 and a blue for a Delve card. Put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. Mostly gonna be creatures, but like with Dig Through Time, you have a little bit of diminishing returns on Delve cards. If you cast this for 1 mana, it's a very good card, of course. But it's gonna compete with other cards. If I'm Jeska and don't have any other Delve cards, this is a huge card because it's gonna be exactly what I want for very cheap. So then it's about a B-. If I have other Delve cards, it goes down to like a C. So this is the type of Delve cards that have diminishing returns with other Delve cards. Because if you're casting this for 4 mana, it's a pretty bad card. Think like Temporal Cleansing without tapping any creatures. It's a 1/1, but Sorcery Speed means it's a worse version of instant speed. So just think about that. Singing Bellstrike, a card I never liked, but other people loved for some reason. 1 and a blue for an aura. And when that's bad for you tap enchant creature and it doesn't untap. But it has 6 untap. So if it didn't have the 6 untap, it would be a pretty good card. Like a Bitter Chill from the last Eldraine set. But this one does have a downside instead of an upside. So the problem with this card is that in the late game, everyone's just gonna free this card. So what happens is you play this early and it feels like you played a removal spell. But then when the game goes on and you don't kill your opponent just flips it up for 6. So it's okay, and like Jeska, you are getting a prowess trigger. You get to lock something down, and ideally you get to kill your opponent before you can untap your opponent can untap. But I think it's a D+, not a good card. Stubborn Denial, another card that's not very good. Blue mana, you counter a non-creature spell unless the controller pays 1. So it's like a negate Force Spike, which is not a good card in Limited. But Ferocious, you get to have this being a negate for 1 mana. The thing is, negate is not a good card in Limited, and making it cost 1 mana doesn't help you that much because the difference between 2 and 1 when you have Ferocious may not even be that huge. So I think this is an F. I would not play it. Just that negates are usually not the cards you want in Limited. You can side them in, but this is unreliable. So the problem is that it's both doesn't hit the things you want and it's unreliable. Pretty bad combination. Taigan Scheming, 1 and a blue, sorcery. You look at the top 5 cards of your library, you put any number of them in your graveyard and the rest on top. So you get to scry 5, but you are down a card, and you may be able to enable Delve. Not a good card though, I think it's a D-. It's very filler. The fact that this is basically a little bit of scry and maybe a little bit of mana, it's just not worth a card. 1000 Winds, 4 blue for a 5/6 flyer. So now we have a Mahmouti Djinn. But it also has Morph for 7. So, and when it's turned face up, you return all other tapped creatures to their owner's hand. So if you flip this up during your opponent's combat, everything that attacked just goes away. And you have complete control over this. It's almost impossible for you to wreck yourself somehow. Maybe if you got some creatures with stun counters on them that you have to bounce them. Maybe your opponent taps this in response. But this is good on both the front side and the back side, because 6 mana 5/6 flyer is not embarrassing, and as a morph, it has a huge effect on the game. I think it's an A-, very good card. But don't be afraid to just hardcast it if the situation calls for it. Treasure Cruise. Wow, this card. 7 and a blue for a delve, draw 3 cards. This is almost the same card as Dig Through Time and Set Adrift. It's a card that is good if you don't have too many other delve cards. But 7 colors is so much that if you are a dedicated Sultai deck that can enable this, sure. But it also hurts your other delve cards. But if I'm a Jeskai deck that doesn't have any other delve cards, I want one of these. Because then it's gonna be a very cheap card that triggers prowess by its own and also digs me towards cards that trigger prowess. All in all, it's worse than Dig Through Time at finding relevant cards, but it's better because it doesn't have double blue. So I think it's a C+ in the right deck. This is not as good as in Constructed though as Dig Through Time. But it's not unplayable and it's not a bomb. Water World, 4 blue for an instant, you return up to 2 target creatures to your owner's hand. Don't like this card, even in a Jeskai deck, it's 6 mana so much. And yes, you can bounce morphs after they flipped up, but I think it's a D. Pretty bad, honestly. Don't let the rarity fool you. Weave Fate, another pretty bad card, 3 and a blue for an instant, you draw 2 cards. So the idea is Jeskai, this triggers prowess, you draw into cards that trigger prowess. Or Sultai, you draw some cards and this goes to the graveyard, then you can delve. It's another D+, pretty mediocre. It's just 4 mana is too much. Wetland Sambar, another mediocre card, 1 and a blue for a 2/1. That's it. So I guess the idea is that this blocks morphs and can attack into morphs early, but it becomes completely outclassed in the late game. Against the Mardu decks, they have 1/1 tokens, and this is just embarrassing. It's another D. It's a card that you can fill out your deck with if you're desperate. It is an elk. Whirlwind Adapt, 4 and a blue for a 4/2 hexproof prowess. So the idea is to put some auras on this. This became better in when you got Fate Reforged, because there you had some good auras. There was also a card called Temur Battle Rage. This card was very good with, because it gave it double strike and trample and also had prowess. It's a build around mostly because it's just, even though it has hexproof, it just has 2 toughness, so it's just gonna trade off for something bad, and prowess doesn't help too much there, because in the late game your opponent's gonna have a 3-powered creature. So it's a D+, but it could be a bit around C+ if you got some good things to put on it. Or if you're blue teamer with some barrage of boulders, because then you can have that as a game plan. Just play a bunch of these and then your opponent can't kill them, and then eventually you're gonna falter and win. So that was blue, so let's go to black. We already talked about Abzan and Mardu, and we also talked about Sultai, so we already talked about all the archetypes, and Mardu, aggressive, Abzan, mid-range, Sultai, control. So some of these cards is gonna be better in Mardu. So the first card is Bellowing Salbert, 3 and a black for a 4/5 warrior and orc. Raid, you lose 4 life unless you attack. So if you can enable this, it's a 4/5 for 4 without a downside with a good creature type. If you can't enable it, sometimes you don't care because you're aggressive or you're ahead on the board. But yeah, it's good. It's very big and solid. I will give it a C+. A 4 mana 4/5 with a good creature type is just rock solid. But sometimes you are gonna get hurt because you're not gonna be able to raid it, and losing 4 life is a lot. But C+. Bitter Revelation, 3 and a black for a sorcerer. You look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of them in your hand or rest into your graveyard, you lose 2 lives. You are up a card, you have selection, you put 3 cards in your graveyard, this card plus the 2 you put into your graveyard. So remember this card being okay, but a little risky and clunky, because there are some matchups where you use casters you feel like you're losing. Sometimes I played Against this card, and yes, I fist pump when my opponent cast this card because this was the perfect card that I wanted my opponent to cast. My opponent didn't affect the board and lost some life. I think it's about a C on average. I've been mostly look to play it in Sultai. It's also decent in Absent. More do I like it less because I want to affect the board, but this is also a card I almost never want to play more than one because unless it could be a sideboard card too. Let's say I have one main deck and I can side in the second one in a grindy matchup. But it is a card that's it's very swingy. Sometimes it feels amazing to cast it. You are up a card selection and you get to enable your delve cards. So sometimes it's just you just feel like you can't cast the card. So let's see, but it's a pretty swingy card. Blood-Soaked Champion, black mana for a 2/1. It can't block, and raid you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. So mostly good in Mardu or Black-White Warriors. It is a warrior as well. There it's about a B-, it's just what you want. It can enable raid early. Even late game you can attack with this, your opponent just eats it, but then you bring it back and you enable your other raid stuff. If you mill it randomly it can be good. So it's a B-, B in a Black-White or a Mardu deck, and in Sultai or in Absan it's less good. It's like a C- or something. I guess it's nice if you randomly mill it, but the fact that you can't block means that some games you play this will do absolutely nothing for you if you're one of those archetypes. Dead Drop. This is probably the most expensive delve cards in the set. 9 and a black for a delve sorcerer. Target player sacrifices 2 creatures. So that's very powerful, but it does take a lot, and I think it will take a dedicated Sultai deck for me to want to play this. There it's pretty good. The problem is that if you're playing like a Martyr, they may have some 1/1 tokens, and then it loses a lot of its value. I think it's about a C+. I think that you need to enable it, and even then, it can be fantastic, but it can also do very little. So it's a very swingy card again. Debilitating Injury, 1 and a black for an aura, enchant creature -2/-2. This is better than it looks. You may compare it to Deadweight and think that it's worse, and of course it is strictly worse from in a vacuum, but it does kill morphs, and it's very nice if you can play this on a morph, just get rid of it before it flips up. It also, you can put it on a prowess creature like the 2/1 flyer, and once the prowess, even if that creature has gotten some prowess triggers or something else, it will eventually die. You can also put it on a large creature and shrink it. I think it's a C+. It's a good card, and it's better than it looks. Despise, black mana for sorcery. You get to look at your opponent's hand, take a creature or planeswalker from it, and that player discards that card. Not a good card, particularly because you are down mana with this card, as with always. You take a card from your opponent's hand that your opponent didn't have to spend mana on. You may also whiff in the late game. This doesn't have like a built-in protection like some of the newer cards. You don't get to draw a card if you miss. I think it's a D. D for Despise. It is nice that it goes to the graveyard and help you with Delve, but it's pretty mediocre. Disowned Ancestor. I remember liking this card. Black mana for 0/4, so it blocks very good. It also has Outlast 1 and a black. So this is mostly good in a Absan deck, but it could be decent in Mardu. It is a warrior. And a nice thing is that this can just enable raid pretty easily. So you turn one this, and you can attack because it doesn't have defender. And you can play your 2/1 that make your opponent discard a card, or the 2 for it gives you a 1/1. All in all, I think it's about a C. But one problem with this card is that it's pretty bad top deck because it gets it's a 1-drop that doesn't do much in the late game. I guess it can sometimes randomly pick up like a flying or a lifelink from something else, but it's okay. It is a little better than it looks, I think. Beautiful Return, 3 and a black for a sorcerer, return up to 2 target creature cards from a graveyard to a hand. Very slow and clunky. There is no built-in self-mill with this card. I think it's another D. It's a card you can sideboard in, I guess. Empty the Pits, XX black. I think it's the only time we've ever seen this mana cost. It has Delve though, so that can't pay for the black, but it can pay for X. And you put X 2 black zombie creatures onto the battlefield tapped, which is sad because you can't block with it. Even though it is an instant, so maybe you can surprise your opponent. Yeah, so this card has a lot of problems. It's 4 black mana. The creatures comes into play tapped, and the Delve only pays for the X. Mostly I think this is a bad card. So mostly this is an F, but in a Sultai deck that has pretty heavy black, has a turbo mill, and you don't have too many other Delve cards, then maybe you can get up to like a C+. But I think I will mostly just pass this card and don't bother with it. Next one though is great. Grim Harry Specs, 2 and a black for a 3/2. It has more for a black. And whenever another non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. So this is a card that's fine to hardcast and it's fine to morph it up. The idea with morphing is that it's going to be a surprise. So you play this as a morph, your opponent kills one of your other cards, maybe another morph, and then you get to flip it up and draw a card. But it's not a terrible card to even play. And there are some matchups your opponent doesn't have too many removal spells. You're going to run away with the game because your opponent's, every time a creature trades, you get to draw a card. So your opponent's going to feel like they can't win because you play against like a Jeskai deck with mostly bounce and freeze cards. You're gonna play this card and you're gonna get to draw a lot of cards. So I think it's a B, rock solid card. I mean, like now the bomb, it's pretty fragile also. And if your opponent kills this, you are not up a card, but it's solid though, and it's very annoying as well. Gurmo Swiftwing, 1 and a black for a 1/2 flying first strike haste. Not a good card. The problem is that it only has 1 power, so you need to enable it somehow. If this had lifelink instead of first strike, it would be so much better because first strike is a little bit of a waste on a flyer, a 1-powered flyer. If it had lifelink, it would be good. Now I think it's mediocre. It's like a D+. It does enable raid though, so if you're desperate for a raid enabler, sure, you can play it. Kiru Bloodsucker. I remember I liked this card more than other people did. 2 and a black for a 2/2. Whenever a creature you control with toughness 4 or greater dies, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So if you can get this card up to 4 toughness somehow, it will trigger by itself. You can sacrifice another creature to put a counter on this, which could help you enable this eventually. So I mostly like this card as that I played it, and then every trade I made I get to make some drains. And then in the late game, I could even have this like a finisher card. I don't think this card is amazing, but I remember liking this card in Absan because it just made all the trades so much more annoying. And it also had some good, whenever your opponent played a removal spell on your other creatures, you could grow this. So I don't think it's a great card. I think it's a C-, but I don't think it's unplayable. Next card though is very close to unplayable, though it has very great art. Kiru Dreadmaw, 4 and a black for a 4/4 defender, and you can pay 1 and win, sacrifice another creature, you gain life equal to the sacrifice creature's toughness. Why? My question when I see this card is why? Why would I want to play this card? It's a low power defender, 4/4/5, and you can gain me some life if I sacrifice another creature. So I just don't get why you would want to play this card. You can gain some life, but you're paying 5 mana for a 4/4 defender. I don't get it. I think this is an F, and I think it's just why? Why? I mean, if you're defensive, but you have to sacrifice creatures to gain the life, so that can be annoying, but I don't know. Krumar Bondkin, 3 black for a 5/3 warrior. 4 and a black morphs it. It's okay, it's like, it's a solid, it's a little annoying that it doesn't have more than 3 toughness, so it's gonna trade off even when you morph it up. I think it's a C-. It is a warrior though, and it has high power, so there seems the ideal scenario is probably you attack with this and it gets through and you get to attack for 5. That's sweet, I guess. C- though. Mardu Skullhunter, 1 and black for a 2/1. It enters the battlefield tap, but if you raid it, your opponent discards a card, so you can play like the 0/4. Or you can just, this is a card that you don't have to play on turn 2, but I think this card is nice. It's a C+ in a black-white warrior deck or a Mardu deck. In Absan it's also okay. I don't like it too much in Salt. You're not that aggressive, so you're not gonna get the trigger and you don't get to block with it. But I think it's solid. It's a C+. Mere Ignite, 3 and a black for a 2/3 with Outlast for a black, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on has Death Touch. It's worse than the white ones we started off with here, because Death Touch is so much worse than flying on lifelink. But it's not terrible, and if you combine this card with the white First Striker, your opponent could be in a world of hurt because you have First Strike Death Touch on all your creatures with counters on it. So this is mostly an Absent card, or maybe like a black-white warrior deck card. The problem is, of course, that this is not a warrior by itself. I think it's about a C. I don't think it's an amazing card, but it's not a terrible card because eventually you are going to get a 3/4 Death Toucher for 4, and that's pretty burly. And it may pick up also some other cards. And look out for the combo with the white First Striker, I guess. Molting Snakeskin. The auras in this set are pretty bad generally. Black mana for an enchant creature. Enchant gets +2/+0, so no toughness boost here. And has 2 and a black regenerated. So the theory is that you play this with mana up, and then you have this card that becomes a threat that's hard to deal with. Yeah, just that you don't get any toughness boosting. So let's say you put this on like a 2 toughness creature, there is still the debilitating injury, for example. And you're gonna have to hold 3 mana up for the rest of the game, otherwise your opponent may just kill it. So I think it's another D card. I don't like it. Also, there isn't much reason to play auras in black. Blue-black with a 4/2 hexproof, you could make it a 6/2 or 7/3 for a turn. Murderous Cut, 4 and a black for a delve card, and it destroys a creature. I would play this for 5 mana, and the fact that it gets cheaper is even better. I think it's a B+. It's a fantastic card. And I don't care how many other delve cards, I'm still gonna play it, of course. Because it's just a fine deal for 5 mana, and when you cast this for 2 mana, it feels awesome. So B+ for Murderous Cut. Necropolis Fiend, 7 black for a 4/5 with delve, and has flying. And X tap, exile X cards from your graveyard, and target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. I never liked this card because one of the problems with the loss ability is that you're not going to have too many cards left in your graveyard if you're casting a 9 mana delve card. And you have to tap your 4/5 flyer to kill something, which is worth it if you're killing something large, but if you're killing something small, you don't get to attack. So I never liked this card too much. I think it's a pretty bad delve enabler, but if I'm somehow, like maybe I'm Absent deck with almost no delve in my deck, sure, I'm gonna play this card about a B- level, but I think mostly this is a D level card. I don't think it's a very good card. Raider Spoils, 3 and a black for an enchantment. Creature you control get +1/+0, so that's not worth it, but it does something at least. And whenever a warrior you control this combat time should play, you may pay 1 life, you draw a card. So this is a build around. It does 2 things. It buffs up your small warriors to make them larger, and whenever you get through, you get the card back. So I think it's a build around B- about there. In a warrior deck, I think I would play this card. But you need a lot of creatures, you need a lot of warriors, and there are a lot of decks where you don't want to play this card. Rakshasa's Secret, 2 and a black for a sorcery. Target opponent discards 2 cards, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. So this puts 3 cards in your graveyard for delve. I almost somehow like this card better than Bitter Revelation in some situations because it's 1 mana cheaper, you don't lose any life, you are still getting a card advantage. So in some sense, it's also a better delve enabler. The problem, of course, is that in the late game, your opponent may not have any cards left in the hand. But this card can feel pretty good to play on turn 3. You clear out 2 of your opponent's cards and you're good to go for delve. So in a Sultai deck, I think I like this card about a C+. I think it's a little bit of a sleeper. And in most other decks, I don't want to play it. So you can side it in also if your opponent has a slow deck with some high costing creature, you may be able to get the last cards. But it's pretty solid though. C+ in the right deck. Retribution of the Ancients, black mana for enchantment. Black, remove X +1/+1 counters from among creatures you control. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. I don't like this card because you are spending counters. It's not free to kill something, which is nice. But how ahead are you if you like remove 3 counters from your creatures and kill one of your... You lost the counters, which you put there somehow. So you're not even ahead on stats. You might be killing an evasive creature, but I just don't see how this card is worth a card. So I'm gonna give it an F. I don't just you're spending resources to kill stuff, and that's not a good place to be because the resources you spend are first of all not easy to get. They also you're downgrading your creatures significantly to do that. So I'm gonna give this card an F. Rite of the Serpent. 4 black for a sorcery. You destroy a creature. If that creature had a +1/+1 counter on it, you get a 1/1 snake. So on turn 6 you get a 1/1. Very clunky and slow. 6 mana is about the highest I want to go for this card. I think this card is mediocre. It's a D+, C- level card. It's just so expensive. And the 1/1 doesn't even matter that much by that point. So pretty mediocre, honestly. Another mediocre card is Rotting Mastodon, 4 and a black for a 2/8. So I'm not really sure what you are trying to accomplish with this card. It's a 5 mana very great blocker, I guess. I think it's a D+, pretty mediocre. Maybe you have some toughness boosting stuff, which I haven't even seen yet, but there are some cards. Ruthless Ripper. This card I remember being great. Black mana for a 1/1 Death Touch. Already it's a card you're not embarrassed to play or hard cast. But it has more for a Mila black card. And when it turns face up, target player loses 2 life. So this can lead to some... It probably feels worse than it is, but the nice thing about this card is that you can block a large morph when this is morphed down. You're even tapped out. Then your opponent flips up a huge Woolly Loxodon on like a 6/7. And you just flip this up. Your opponent loses 2 life and they trade. So it's a blowout in terms of mana. You're not ahead on cards, but you are ahead on tempo and some life. So I think this is a B-. I just love this card in every black deck. Because Sultai loves an early blocker that goes to the graveyard easily. And Mardu likes the 2 life plus getting to attack. This can also very good raid enabler. And Absent doesn't mind a good blocker either. So it's just good in every black deck, B-. Probably the best of these flip-up cards. Yeah, it is better than the red and the green one. Spoiler alert. Shambling Attendant, 7 and black for a 3/5. Delve and Death Touch. Yeah, not great. Again, you are spending your graveyard as a resource. That is a resource for your other Delve cards. To play a good card, but how much would this cost for you to feel like it was great? At 5 mana, you're about what you want to play. I would probably play 5 mana for a 3/5 Death Toucher. I wouldn't feel like awesome about it. If this costs 4, then we're talking a great card. So this is not one of those cards. The less Delve you have in your deck, the better it is. So if I don't have any other Delve cards, sure, about a C+, because then I want this type of card. If I have a lot of other Delve cards, I don't want to play it, and it's just not worth it. Because yes, it's a very good annoying blocker and attacker, but it doesn't do anything broken. Sidisi's Pet, 3 and a black for a 1/4. It has lifelink and more for 1 and a black. Lifelink on a 1-powered creature is a little... it's not that great. And if you flip it up, it still doesn't have 2 power. So I think it's a pretty mediocre morph. Again, I can't give morphs too bad of a grade, so I'm going to give it a C-. Sultai Scavenger. So this card I like more than the Death Touches. 5 and a black for a 3/3 flyer with Delve. So this one has evasion and it gets through. And it is also a warrior. So it's a card you can play with the Raider spoils I mentioned earlier. I think it's about a C, though. It's nothing like awesome, but it's a solid card. And I like it in Mardu and Sultai. Don't love it in Absent, but it's not unplayable. Swarm of Bloodflies. This is an interesting card. 4 and a black for a 0/0 flyer. It enters with 2 counters on it. So it's a 5 mana 2/2 flyer. But whenever another creature dies, it gets a counter. So that's your creatures and your opponents. So what often happens with this card is you play it early or on turn 5 and you hope your opponent doesn't have a removal. And then the game goes on with trades, removals, etc. Ideally your removal. And then it goes into a large threat. It also picks up all the bonuses from counters. So imagine this is especially sick with the lifelinker, like the Absent Battle Priest. Because if this turns is like a 3/3 4/4 flying lifelink, it's just over. So I think this card is about a C+. It's a good card, but it's pretty fragile. It takes a while to get going. But it can be very good. The thing about this card is, though, you can never rely on this card to survive. You may have big plans for a card like this, and it may win you the game. but it is very fragile. So if your opponent has any removal, it just dies. So like it's a kind of card that is good, but you can never like rely on the card to win you the game. And next to last card is Throttle, 4 and a black for an instant. Tarkir gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Pretty mediocre. It's a little better than the 6 mana version because 5 mana and instant speed is nice, but it doesn't kill everything, and especially in a set where Morphs gets flips up a lot. But I think it's about a C- level card. It's not as good. It's not that good, but it's a C-. Last black card is Unyielding Krumar, 3 and a black for a 3/3. And you can pay 1 and a white to give it first strike until the end of turn. And it's a warrior as well. So in Black-White Warriors it's a fine card. In Absent it's okay. In Sultai it's terrible. In Absent I want to say it's like a C-. In a Black-White Warrior deck it's about a C. And in a Martyr deck it's about a C as well. There's a threat of activation, which is nice, but in the later stage of the game, the first strike may not be able to get through. It's a decent raid enabler, but the 4 mana is also at about a time in the game where most of the raid cards have already got to be played. But it is nice that you can attack, and your opponent can't block, and then you have mana to spend on the raid card that's a little more expensive. So a range of C to C- for that card.